My name is Ashish Chadha. I'm a professor of film media at the University of Rhode Island, and I am an affiliate with the Saxena Center here. It's a great pleasure to have this book Adda on an extraordinary, interesting book that has just come out just less than a couple of months ago, published by Cambridge University Press. The book is called Network Bollywood: How Star Power Globalized Hindi Cinema by Swapnil Rai. Professor Rai is here. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to introduce Professor Rai, speak a little about the book, and then Professor Rai will speak for about 35 minutes about her book, give us a sense of what the book is about. And then we have three respondents, Meheli Sen, Anuja Jain, and Darshana Sridhar Mini. They're all scholars of Indian cinema, working in different areas of Indian cinema, and they will then respond to Swapnil's presentation, and then we'll have an open discussion. So let me first introduce Swapnil. Dr. Swapnil Rai is, I'm using the Bengali, Swapnil, yeah. Dr. Swapnil Rai is an assistant professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Media at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. As an interdisciplinary scholar, she works at the intersection of media studies, critical cultural communication, women's and gender studies, and industry studies. Focusing on Global South, she investigates how transnational network cultures intersect with media industries with questions of policy, geopolitics, and audience. Dr. Rai earned her PhD from the Department of Radio, Television at the University of Texas at Austin. She also served as a postdoctoral visiting fellow out here at Brown at the Center for Contemporary South Asia, and then taught at College of Film and Moving Images at Wesleyan University. She has published her scholarship in a range of journals such as the Journal of Communication, Culture and Critique, Feminist Media Studies, International Journal of Communication, South Asian Popular Culture, Media, Culture and Society, Jumkurt, Journal of School of Literature, and so on and so forth. But today, for this book, Adda, we will discuss her new book called Network Bollywood: How Star Power Globalized Hindi Cinema. This has recently been published by Cambridge University Press. In this book, Dr. Rai tries to understand how mid-20th century Hindi cinema transformed into a global cinematic practice in the 21st century. At the center of this story of transformation, Dr. Rai convincingly argues are influential mega superstars like Devanand, Raj Kapoor, Dilip Kumar, Amitabh Bachchan in the 20th century, and Amir Khan, Salman Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, and others in the 21st century. This transformation, she argues, is because of the ability of these really big megastars to exceed the confines of their networks they belong to and act as switches. And this is a really interesting theoretical idea that she talks about, which I'm sure she will explain in detail, is that how these star powers are work as switches that illuminate new pathways and turn on connection with other networks that did not earlier exist. She historically shows us that how stars, a group of centrally situated actors within Hindi cinema and the entertainment institution, gained the agency required to successfully define an industry's global trajectory. According to me, Network Bollywood opens up a new conversation and takes the disciplinary discourse of Indian cinematic modernity into a new territory that has not been explored as yet or theorized so eloquently. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rai.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Ashish. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to be here today. So, as Ashish mentioned, I'll be talking about my new book, which I have a copy of as a prop here. So, Network Bollywood: How Star Power Globalized Indian Cinema. So, in my talk today, broadly, since I only have 30 minutes, what I'll try to do is give you like a big picture overview of what are the two major frames the book gets into, explain to you what I mean when I say network Bollywood, and the other idea that Ashish mentioned, star switching power, which I theorize in the book as well. So to give you a quick overview, although I feel like most people in this room know what is Bollywood, but how I've deployed it, I just want to explain that. What is the Bollywood network, and this idea of the Bollywoodization of everything, which was the launching off point for some of the questions that I ask in the book. And then I explain to you what switching power is and give you a quick example and a case study. And then look at the gender dimensions of that, and sort of end with the bigger stakes and over to my respondents to see what they think. Okay, so what is Bollywood? So first off, Bollywood, as many of you know, is a portmanteau term that brings together Bombay and Hollywood, right? And when you look at Bollywood in that way, it seems like this inferior imitative industry, just the term itself constructs it that way. But the thing to always remember is India started making films contemporaneously with Hollywood. This was the first movie that got made, Raja Harishchandra, in 1913, only a few years after Hollywood made its first film. The cinematograph comes to India like in 1896, where the Lumiere brothers did do a showing at the Watson Hotel in Mumbai. And there's the announcement there. So mainly thinking about Bollywood as a term, which I will say is in the global domain, how it's deployed is sort of different, but to understand Bollywood or Indian cinema as an industry that's contemporaneous to Hollywood and has evolved with a same kind of rich history, rich industrial history. Now, what makes this industry unique? Three key things I'd like to point out. Most of you might be familiar with the aesthetics, but song and dance are an integral part of the films. They're usually 3 hours long with an intermission, so like this interesting aesthetic that most movies have. And the other most important thing that my book tries to get into in depth is that stars in Indian cinema have an inordinate amount of power. So here you see Shah Rukh Khan. I know Mehli and a few others are big fans. So will we see you in that crowd, Mehli?
Alas, no, not
No.
yet.
Okay, so there's this sea of people waiting outside Shah Rukh Khan's home balcony, like sometimes for days, to catch a glimpse of a star, to say hi to his fans, like on his birthday or any of these special days. So stars have that kind of power. There are even temples dedicated to stars. So that's another key aspect. The third aspect is the scale. India is, in terms of the number of films it produces, the largest film industry in the world. It makes films in a lot of different languages. What I'm talking about in my book is mostly films made in the Hindi language and stars from the Hindi language film industry. And also in terms of, broadly in terms of ticket sales, even though tickets are priced lower in India, like it's huge in terms of footfalls, how many people actually go to the movies. So it's a huge industry. Now from there, going to my next thing about the Bollywoodization of everything. Okay, so how I've deployed the term Bollywood. So Bollywood in the transnational space has become this moniker for everything to do with India and Indian entertainment, right? So I used to live in Connecticut, and here, like close to Hartford, there's a restaurant called the Bollywood Vegetarian Grill. Right, the restaurant really has nothing to do with Bollywood, not even the decor, but somehow the term is used to signal like Indian food. You have Bollywood jazzercise and Bollywood yoga. I got my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and August 15th, which is the Indian Independence Day, used to be the Austin Bollywood Day, where people would like do flash mobs and dance performances outside the state capitol. So how thinking about in the transnational space, how the term Bollywood is deployed has become more than, and this moniker for everything to do with things Indian and Indian entertainment, even diasporic cultural identity, right? And so people like Ashish Radhayaksha, Amit Rai, and others have used things like the Bollywoodization of everything, but this happens like in the 2000s, post the moment where the Indian government recognized Bollywood or filmmaking as an industry. However, as I just told you, the first film was made in 1913, and then it was recognized as an industry in 2001. So for almost 100 years of its history, this industry existed and been making movies. And so the questions that I sought to ask, and those movies have been globally popular, right? So the question I started with was, like, what were the structures that were sustaining this kind of globalization, right? Who were the key actors? And how I answer it in the book were these Bollywood megastars who, led by individual ambition, were able to leverage their centrality in economic networks, political networks, and the way the industry evolved. They were also key to the industry networks as owners of the major production companies, that they found a way to help this cinema globalize. Okay, so now coming to, like, I've given you sort of the big stakes, a big picture overview. I'll give you my core concepts. The book is called Network Bollywood, How Star Power Globalized Indian Cinema. So let me tell you a bit about how I use the term network. So network, as I say here, in a very basic way, like, are a set of interconnected nodes, that are flexible. So two ways. So networks here are deployed from a dual perspective. One of them is to say that the structure of the industry itself, how it evolves from like a proto-network with fewer stakeholders to a huge scalar agglomerated network, the network Bollywood of today. But the other perspective on networks is they're also sociological networks of power. So so the book interchangeably uses the term networks to signal both these kinds of networks. Okay, so the sociological networks of power have to do with how these individuals, these megastars like Raj Kapoor, like Amitabh Bachchan, were able to use their centrality in different kinds of sociocultural, political, and industrial structures towards specific goals that helped their organizations. And I also, like I said, conceptualize networks as an industrial formation that is structurally flexible and changes in relation to the geography and sort of policy and other things. So the book talks about how these networks have had different configurations at various points in time. So the earliest was what I call the proto-network, which is when all of these different production companies, these are all led by like major stars. And these used to be, in my book, what I call examples of family-led film clusters, where if any of you are familiar with, say, a film like Avara, which is a classic from the 50s that became super popular in the Soviet Union, you have Raj Kapoor be the director and producer of the movie. It was made by his own production company, RK Films. His father plays his on-screen father. His brother plays his younger self. His girlfriend plays his love interest. His friend writes the screenplay. So that becomes like the most typical example of these family, friends-led film clusters that were often helmed by stars. And so at this point, you had these clusters trying to globalize and get their cinema out there through leveraging the different networks. There were through certain diasporic individuals that show up also in the story that helped with this process. Now, then the next stage is where there's the emergency period in India, right? The state is even more negligent. And at that time, 70s, 80s, Bollywood gets deeply mired in criminal economy networks. So that is the next phase. And the third phase is 90s, when the markets begin to open up, and all of this foreign direct investment tries to flow into other industries, which is when filmmakers and filmmaking, they also feel like they should be part of that global process. And you have a star like Amitabh Bachchan, like set up a company like Amitabh Bachchan Corporation Limited. And I will talk about why he was the one, or you can ask me in the Q&A. He was the one who was able to do it, and why no one else. Anyway, so going from there, like from a simple proto-network formation to a more complex agglomerated structure, which is the networked Bollywood today. In its current iteration, as you see here, it's connected to multiple global nodes and hubs ranging from like global institutions and operations of varying scales, both individual nodes and a myriad of like technological networks and different kinds of distribution technologies, right? So in a very basic way, you see how I've mapped the structure of the industry changing and evolving over time. Now, the next question that I focused on, like what I was interested in, how is the globalization happening over time? So in the book, I identify like within this network, the star and star-led production companies remained very central to this globalization process. And reason why I need to do both these things is that my book is not arguing for a individual-driven history, because power doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in relation to a certain structure, right? So these individuals were able to leverage power and do certain things for their organizations that helped open up new markets for Bollywood, but was in relation to certain kinds of structures. So the book then conceptually like focuses on the star, but how star power operates in relation to the industry, state policy, and so on. So now, why were the stars in Bollywood able to be these kind of centrally located nodes, sort of the movers and shakers that could change cinema in certain ways, right? For one, as I told you before, Bollywood is a very star-centric industry. And the second, to understand that kind of power, I theorized this idea of switching power, which comes from sociology, which Castells, Arsenault, and others kind of build on Bourdieu's idea of switching power to talk about, let's say, a person like Murdoch, right, who owns his own media company. He has a lot of like economic clout, he has a lot of political clout, and he can leverage his centrality in all of these networks to accomplish the goals of his organization, News Corp, right? So I build on this framework given by Castells and Arsenault to articulate what I call switching power, star switching power, to understand like these three questions. So what was the kind of power that these stars possessed? And reason why I needed a new term is because Bollywood stars are not Murdoch, right? Nobody stands outside of Murdoch's balcony for 48 hours to catch a glimpse of Murdoch. So these stars were business tycoons, but they had more power. And so I tried to understand these three questions, and with it theorize this conceptual framework of star switching power, where I talk about the effective power within a network and affective power that comes together to give these stars, the kinds of things that a whole different level of prominence in getting and also leveraging elite fan networks in a way to accomplish goals of their organization. So it's best explained with a case study. So let me give you an example of a star like Shah Rukh Khan. Now, Shah Rukh Khan started his career in the 90s, like just when the Indian economy was getting liberalized, and he was voted into filmdom through television, right? And when he started, he was the first to set up a company aptly called Dreams Unlimited. And the first movie that Dreams Unlimited created was this movie called Ashoka, which was about the life of an Indian emperor who popularized Buddhism across Asia. And the rationale behind it was was a story that would have like global cachet and crossover. They also looked at distributing it in Japan. This was the first movie that got a wide release, that had a huge marketing budget, which Shah Rukh Khan like did through his production company, and a wide release in the UK across 85 screens. So biggest at the time. Similarly, simultaneously, you had another star, Amir Khan, who was doing similar things concurrently with a film called Lagan that you guys might have heard of, which got nominated for an Oscar. So my point is that stars within this structure, as businessmen, have been able to create new business models, talk about new things that others in the industry, that create network effects in the industry that people started to follow. So once these early movies came out, there was this whole trend of looking at these markets, creating different kinds of cinema. So their influence works not just across fan networks, but industrial networks as well. Now, getting to the big point of their affective power, right? So this is the story of this magazine, Ishq. I was able to interview the editor. So this girl, 25-year-old, who was pursuing a degree in cultural anthropology, left her program to start this magazine called Ishq, which was dedicated just to Shah Rukh Khan. But over time, it sort of expanded into veritable Bollywood agency where they now organize events, award shows. They even have a podcast for which now they want to interview me because, you know, Shah Rukh Khan is on the cover. Anyway, so the point is that thinking about the affective power, the affective pull that then kind of leads to creating space for Indian cinema in non-traditional markets like Germany. So before this came along, and why did this affect even start? Well, it goes back to the effective power, because Shah Rukh Khan was able to release one of his movies on TV where these women saw it, and, you know, lo and behold, they were fans for life. And now you have a Bollywood agency, and it created a newer market for these kind of films in Germany. Now, this power, like I say, also works across geopolitics, right? So whether it's the United States or Russia or China, there's a lot of very deliberate pull, has historically been like this deliberate effort to cultivate soft power in a way that even though American programs were exported in the 60s, like with Kennedy, there was a specific policy, okay, well, send this stuff. In the Indian media, like this industry was not even an official industry. So these films were making their way like through efforts of certain kinds of individuals like these stars. So what their popularity shows us is that there's a role for non-state actors within broader like cultural diplomacy and geopolitics. And I'll show you that with a quick example. This is the German ambassador to India, his tribute to Shah Rukh Khan. And first I'll show you the movie that they copy, and then their tribute, okay?
बदल रही है रूप जिंदगी, छाँव है कभी कभी है धूप जिंदगी, हर पल यहाँ जी भर जियो, जो है समा कल हो न हो, हर घड़ी बदल रही है रूप जिंदगी, छाँव है कभी कभी है धूप जिंदगी, हर पल यहाँ जी भर जियो, जो है समा कल हो न हो.
Okay, so we'll stop here. And so in this video, there's the German ambassador, the Indian foreign minister, and the German ambassador's wife playing like the three title characters in the movie. And they hired a Bollywood director to help them with it.
हर घड़ी बदल रही है रूप जिंदगी, छाँव है कभी कभी है धूप जिंदगी, हर पल यहाँ जी भर जियो, जो है समा कल हो न हो। हर घड़ी बदल रही है रूप जिंदगी, छाँव है कभी कभी है धूप जिंदगी, हर पल यहाँ जी भर जियो, जो है समा कल हो न हो।
Okay. All right. So the other thing is that it's not just the affect, but how the affect and effective power, all of that is tied together. So when Netflix first goes to India, I mean, you see here Ted Sarandos and Reed Hastings. The first deals that they make are with the two stars I mentioned, Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan, their production companies, and acquired, I was most surprised to find, like, all of their 90s films, even like biggest flops, like Chahat, that, well, I'm not such a big fan, Mehli, so don't get angry, but like all of their flops. So that speaks to their kind of industrial power too, that you know, when a Netflix enters an Indian market to ensure their success, those are the first companies because they're very important businessmen in that context. So anyway, so my book historically looks at these case studies, Raj Kapoor and others that Ashish mentioned his intro, like against the context of the Cold War, Devanand, who tried to create films in collaboration with the US, Raj Kapoor in the Soviet Union, as both countries were trying to influence India in a Cold War context. So it places these stars within a historical backdrop to understand, like I said, relationally their power in the context of the industry, in context of politics. And the key question, I know I'm sort of out of time, so the other key question it gets into is the question of gender, like where were the women in it? And I'd be happy to get more into it in the Q&A, because I am very much out of time. All right, well, thank you so much, and yeah, happy to answer any more questions.
Thank you, Swapnil, for being quick. I hope some of the more interesting issues will come out in the Q&A. The first person I would like to invite is a dear friend, Dr. Mehli Sen. Dr. Sen is an associate professor of South Asian and Global Cinema at the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literature at Rutgers University. Her research area is in post-colonial Indian cinema, particularly Hindi and Bengali language films. She is especially interested in questions of gender, genre, modernity, globalization, and new media cultures. She is an author of Haunting Bollywood, Gender, Genre, and Supernatural in Hindi Commercial Cinema, published in 2017 by University of Texas Press. In this book, she explores the supernatural in Bollywood cinema and the varied modes through which it raises question of film form, history, modernity, and gender in South Asian public cultures. Dr. Sen argues that the supernatural is dispersed among multiple genres and constantly in conversation with the global cinematic forms. She very interestingly and carefully demonstrates that it is an especially malleable impulse that routinely pushes the Hindi popular film into new formal and stylistic territories. She also has published her research in Cinema Journal, Framework, South Asian Popular Culture, among other places. And in 2013, she co-edited an anthology titled Figuration in Indian Film, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Up to you, Melly.
Thank you very much for that very, very generous introduction and for inviting us here to discuss this wonderful book. Before I talk about Professor Rai's very capacious, very rich research in this book, I wanted to talk about a recent incident that happened in India, which is that the current ruling government's Minister Subramaniam Swamy put out a tweet in response to the Prime Minister's tweet when he was going to Qatar. This was, okay, long story short. 9 naval officers were held captive in Qatar. The details seem very fuzzy to me, but the charges were espionage, right? And all of Indian media was up in arms about how dare they keep our valiant Navy officers prisoners, what can we do to get them back, etc., etc. And they had been, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, sentenced to death or life in prison or some such, death, right? So this was a very big deal. And then Shah Rukh Khan, I woke up, I had dozed off a little bit because it's late afternoon, but I woke up with all the images, so thank you. Apparently, Shah Rukh Khan had a role to play in the release of these 9 naval officers who were returned to India. I wouldn't give any credence to this, except that SRK's office actually put out an official statement saying, no, we had nothing to do with it. Diplomacy is best left to the, people who do it. Very intriguing. And then 2 days ago, Amir Khan says, these things happen all the time. So I was thinking about Swapnil's work as I was watching this drama unfold, I mean, now he's involved in all sorts of diplomatic coups. But okay, so that was funny and fun to think about. But thank you for writing this very rich and capacious book. I wanted to talk about a few things that were very generative for me, very useful to think about the industry. The first is, of course, this idea of the network, right? And stars have been theorized in many ways across film industries of the world. But what I found really interesting about Swapnil's engagement is the fluidity with which she uses different lenses, right? So stars are not stable categories. And what is especially useful, I think, is worth mentioning here is that this is not just a film studies book. It's a film studies book, it's a media studies book, it's a history of capitalism, globalization. It's also a book on sociology, right? So it's doing many different things and really interesting things. And what was also important to note is that film is only one aspect that constellates around the star. So if we think of the star as a sort of node, but a slippery one, we might call it a rhizomatic formation, if we were to use an old-fashioned term, I suppose. The policy, what Richard Dyer has famously called the structured policy, and I'm very curious to hear what you think of the structured end of the structured policy, because it seems to me that in your work, you're saying that it's not so structured after all, right? That the slippages and the fluidity is so much that it could just veer into any direction. So So I appreciate the fact that Swapnil takes really protean points of entry into the figure of the star, who continues to sort of elude our theoretical frameworks even as we try to contain them. And I found the affect economy very powerful, because the question of economy is not separate from the question of desire. And I wanted to know more about desire, which you sort of hint at, but don't really pursue, in the sense of what kind of psychical investments are also part of this enabling force of the star. So Swapnil provides us with an alternate history of the industry, an alternate history of Bombay cinema. And the star comes to be the central figure in a interface, and I'm sure Swapnil has elaborated this more articulately. What I'm trying to say is that the star comes to be meaningful at the interface of several discourses which shift over time, right? So the discourses that gave birth to Amitabh Bachchan's power are not exactly the same discourses that surround Shah Rukh Khan. But it's a similar kind of clout, right? In a transformed industrial formation. So that was very useful. And let's see. I also like the book's organization very much. It reads like a book. It does not read like a few essays that were strung together by a panicked person who needs a book, right? Which is, I digress, but which is a lot of film studies books, right? So I really appreciated the fact that the organization of the book is so careful and deliberate and clear. It's also very beautifully written, which I enjoyed, very readable. I have a few questions that I will throw out here. So the politics of presence, Swapnil, right, is something that sort of permeates the book. So I was very curious to hear your thoughts on something like the phenomenon of Sushant Singh Rajput, who's not certainly the kind of star that Shah Rukh Khan or Amir Khan are. However, I think something very interesting has happened, and I hope you'll write about this, is basically what I'm saying. Because what happens when we look at stardom through the lens of absence? Sushant Singh Rajput was a big star, but not a huge star, right? But he has become a huge star after his unfortunate and untimely death. And one of the reasons he has become a huge star is because one of the discourses that gathered around his death was COVID. When everybody was trapped inside the house, we had nothing else to do except obsess about this young man who possibly killed himself, right? So what happens when the star discourse becomes a discourse of absence rather than Shah Rukh Khan, who's constantly present everywhere all the time, luckily for us? I also wanted to think about the political in a larger sense. Again, the Sushant case enables me to do this very well, because for those of you who may not know, after Sushant Singh's passing, there was a huge hue and cry in particularly sort of right-wing Hindu rights circles about boycotting Bollywood, right? So the star power there, or however we theorize his, the sublime that he has become post his demise, the star power there, in fact, started working against the interests of the industry. To the extent that there are full-time news, I use the word news loosely, news channels who are dedicated full-time to the investigation into his death and the fact that they believe he was murdered. Right? So the point being, there is so much to think about in terms of prurient interest, in terms of the boredom brought on by COVID, in terms of the industrial disarray that followed COVID, right? But also this notion of someone who becomes a star through a very deliberate political mobilization, including the elections in Bihar, as we know, right? So I'm very, what would happen if we were to think of the star in less, not positive, but positivist terms? Was one question that I wanted to ask. And the other thing that I found really provocative in your book is the final chapter on OTT, right? Which is something that interests me a great deal. And I wondered if you think a different, I mean, yes, Sarandos and Shah Rukh are like best buddies and all that. But if you think an alternate model of stardom or even star switching is emergent at the moment. And I was thinking of Irfan actually when I was reading your book. I was constantly thinking of Irfan and the kind of stuff that he enabled, right? You talk about Shashi Kapoor. I was very, very pleased that very few people do. But what about a figure like Irfan? Again, not the kind of star that you highlight, but someone who was very critical in this circulation of affect, effect, and economies of exchange and transaction, right? Or even someone like Radhika Apte, right? Who, and these are all people who work in the OTT space as much as they work in feature films, if not more. So is the new media, and I'm using again the new media kind of as a catch-all term, to think about what OTTs are doing to your theoretical framework, if anything, and how this moment might demand a retheorization. And so the Sushant Singh question and the OTT question, in my head at least, are not hermetically sealed off from each other. There's a way in which they can be in conversation, right? Because both happened both sort of gained momentum in that crucible of the COVID moment. So those were my larger questions, and I'm sure some others will come up over the course of the Adda, but thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Meheli. I am now going to ask Dr. Anuja Jain to be the second respondent. Dr. Jain is an assistant professor of film studies and global South Asian studies at Wesleyan University. Her scholarly work focuses on South Asian film, media, and visual culture. Her essays have appeared in journals like Velvet Like Trap, South Asian Popular Culture, Mark, Screen, along with multiple anthologies. At the moment, she is working on a book-length study of independent documentary films and video installation in India from the 1990s to the early 2000s. Dr. Jain's book integrates the radical and the ethical implications of linkages of crisis, documentary, new media art practices, and spectatorship within the non-Western South Asian and post-colonial framework. The project has a resounding global resonance and contributes to the fields of transnational documentary studies, non-Western histories of video art, media technologies, memory, trauma, and South Asian studies. I invite Dr. Jain to come and speak for about 10-15 minutes and respond to Shopman's book.
All right. Thank you, Ashish, for that introduction and for really facilitating this wonderful book Adda, very much necessitated by Swapnil's wonderful book, which I really enjoyed reading. So for me, star studies, as one thinks about, it has been a very vibrant and elastic field, which has been in constant revision and expansion, as the book also contributes to it and shows us both within transnational film studies and particularly South Asian studies since the 1990s. And within the South Asian context, particularly, there have been several book-length studies of specific Indian film stars, notable star dynasties, and the transnational reception of Indian film stars. And where Swapnil's scholarship and where the book really makes an intervention is in extending this scholarship by really tracing the role of the stars, past and present, in shaping what she very effectively showed in her presentation also, Hindi cinema's globe-spanning networks and its globalization. And I think what I really enjoyed about the book was that how it has this wide range of methodological lens, where it engages with a wide variety of concepts which have been related to star studies as a broader field. So branding, audience, reception, the fine distinction between the celebrity and the star, the physicality of the stars, the malleability, the consumability of the stars through different sites, and how stars function as assemblages, auteurs, workers, and entrepreneurs. So I really enjoyed how you set up the term network, that there is this kind of a constantly evolving and shifting network which brings together these multiple functions that the stars have been performing and they continue to perform as the various ecologies within which they are situated as they evolve. And what I think for me, as someone who teaches broader field of film and media studies and thinks about stardom, stardom has largely been explored theoretically as a way of finding meaning in the films, the film text itself, and linking production, text, and the audience. And for me, where the nuance and the departure of your scholarship and the book lies in it is in its outward movement. That beyond the frameworks of a text-centered analysis or audience reception frameworks that largely inform the field, the book instead theorizes the effective and the affective power of the stars, and what you just now also talked about, the star switching power, which is mobilized by these interconnections between dynamics of stardom, fandom, the industrial and technological shifts, the emergent media ecologies, particularly how it shifts with the rise of piracy, with the digital expansions, the social media, the political and financial economies, and cultural diplomacy as it does. What I particularly find also very effective about the book as the chapters, the way it is structured really well, that how as it maps this Hindi cinema's industrial history and its globalization through the stars' affective and strategic power, the book persuasively argues and illustrates the seminal role that the star has played at the various historical junctures in initiating important business models, industrial changes, owing their ability to what you argue and show in the book, to exceed the networks it's themselves within which they belong. The book, as it tells this relational story of star switching power and the Bollywood network and why some stars possess a superseding power. I particularly enjoyed your chapter on the female stars. That for me really stood out, that as you kind of show that while the argument that you make that despite the unique trajectories of female stardom, particularly for the contemporary stars like Aishwarya Rai and Priyanka Chopra, but there is a contradictory nature and inherent instability of gendered stardom in both the local and the global industrial flows, which they both inhabit in different ways. So I really like the very cautionist optimism in the narrative and in the story that you tell, which continues to the final chapter also, where you interrogate the OTT platforms and the significance of these emergent platforms for the means of production, distribution, and consumption of both the cinema, but also the kind of the recalibration of the star agency itself, that how the star structures as they change with the new nodes which enter these networks, like the talent agencies and the other kind of players, so to say, that who enter, that how they change. And I really liked that something which you really attended, that while there is a recalibration, but there is also a reproduction of the kind of the structures of caste politics, the gender politics that has really remained unchanged within these emergent networks. And on this related note, as I was thinking about your final chapter and the book, I would really like to hear your thoughts more about the implications of the political in the local global network. That where do you think is that third kind of the hyphenated political? What kind of negotiations were and are most urgently necessitated for the networks within the networked Bollywood, with the rise of particularly Hindu nationalism and its current authoritarian consolidation in India? That what are the implications for us to rethink these networks and these nodes which inform these networks? And here I go back to your chapter on particularly Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan, which seems to be both the center of the book and kind of shows us that it ties the past and the present in ways. And there you talk about the affective power of these stars, that how that emerges from their roles and the star personas that are shaped by the cinematic text themselves. And there has been scholarship on the how there is been a fashioning of a particular secular and cosmopolitan star personas around both the stars, that there has been a very self-conscious fashioning which really propels then the global flows which they are able to propel. However, thinking about the 1990s, and also because I work on the 1990s and I had to like situate them within that if 1990s is a decade of liberalization and the restructuring in all the service sectors and industries, including cinema and the Hindi film industry, as many people here also know, that it is the decade of unprecedented socio-political shifts also, with the mobilization of the Hindu nationalist discourses. So my question is that in what ways did these shifts really impact the switching power of and the agency of stars like Shah Rukh Khan and particularly Amir Khan because of their religious affiliations? And I was immediately also reminded of this when you showed the Times India, you were showing the images, and if I'm not wrong, one of them was from Rais. Like I could immediately, the marking of the body, like how the stars, if there is this persona of a very cosmopolitan and a secular star, which is kind of performed through social media over and over again by the stars, and both of them participate in it and very consciously do it, but then the bodies of the stars are also very much marked by those kind of a different kind of markers, which also remind us. And here the very dark Kohol-lined eyes of Shah Rukh Khan, which were the very evocative of him playing a Muslim protagonist in Rais. I was immediately, that just looking at that image, I was reminded of that affiliation that he has. So that was my kind of question, that what kinds of strategies then are required in rethinking of the networks that is required by the stars to continue to dominate both the hierarchical structures which you argue continue to persist, but also the new emergent networks in a very new kind of a political global economy within which these networks are situated. Yeah, I will stop there, and I'm sure we will have more questions as we talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuja. So, our final respondent is Dr. Darshana Sridhar Mini. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication Arts at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her teaching and research lie at the intersection of gender, sexuality, transnational media, migrant media, and screen cultures of South Asia. At this moment, we are waiting for her forthcoming book, Rated A, A Soft Porn Cinema and Mediation of Desire in India, which will be published by University of Chicago, University of California Press, which examines the genre of soft porn in India and how it impacts public discourse on sexuality, obscenity, sex worker, and sex education. Using archival and ethnographic methods, her project tracks the emergence of the genre of soft porn film in South Indian-based Malayalam film industry from the 1970s to the early 2000s by focusing on formation of media publics, relationship formation and exchange in public sphere, facilitated by affective power of media. Her work historically explores soft porn, film production, circulation, and exhibition history, and at the same time is rooted in ethnographic investigation of production practice of this kind of film industry. I think this will be a book. This will be the first book-length work on the history of a marginal yet an overwhelming important form of cinematic production in India, which I think, and this is my belief, and I've told her, I think it will push the discourse on Indian cinematic modernity into really uncharted territories. Darshana.
Thank you, Ashish, for organizing this and also for such a kind and generous introduction. The book is yet to come out, so it's always good to have this kind of good feeling about what is out there. All right, just give me a second. All right, so since two of my panelists have already spoken about the book, I just wanted to give what I thought the networked power and switching power was doing for my own reading as someone who doesn't work solely on Bollywood, but on regional film industries in India, and how far can we take the star switching power into other frameworks and other discourses and try and see how applicable that those discourses can be. So in Networked Bollywood, Swapnil writes about star switching power as a framework to understand the way stardom operates in Bollywood and what this could tell us about the nuances around transnational media production and distribution practices. The book explores the business of filmmaking as it crisscrosses between cultural diplomacy, transnational co-productions, global travels, and capital accumulation. So in Swapnil's account, there are certain specificities around which who or what kind of stars or stardom will qualify for star switching power. So not everyone can even hope to become someone who is facilitating star switching. Firstly, they have to be catalyst who can propel expansion and has the acumen in moving between home and abroad. And they should also be able to leverage their iconicity and glamour to build new connections. So in other words, they should be able to capitalize on the cultural and social capital through financial investment and pave new pathways for the industry. So Swapnil uses this provocative term called network effects to trace the adaptability of star switching power that can imbue a specific effective gesture to the way stardom operates and is written about in the context of media globalization. Network Bollywood's frame of reference is in the interface between global and nation, encapsulated in the IIFA Awards in London or global events where Bollywood as a brand can be marketed. And film industry can also double up as a site of cultural diplomacy. So the case studies, that form part of this fantastic work includes various transnational contexts like Afghanistan, Soviet Union, and United States, where you have a significant diasporic community engaging in Bollywood films and also opening out Bollywood for a global audience. So some of the nuances I really liked about her book was, mapping out Amitabh Bachchan Corporation Limited the one failure, right? Like we all know of Amitabh Bachchan and the stardom around him in a very significant way. But I was interested in that failure that she was able to track, why it was a failure. But again, the global beauty pageant show that he kind of initially started became like a big thing after a few years. And also like, if Raj Kapoor and Dev Anand spearheaded Indian cinema's global reach in Soviet Union by being intermediaries who could translate the potential of cinema to bridge language and national borders. Cultural diplomacy was forged through other occasions as well. For instance, the US State Department invitation that was extended to the Indian film delegation to visit Hollywood studios in 1955. Thus, filmmaking was in itself seen as a venture that has ideological undertones, both used by the state in identifying and consolidating cultural power, as well as in using film screenings during the visit to popularize Indian cinema to the international audience. So Swapnil also uses a cartoon in the book from Film India, where Baburao Patel offers a critique on who can constitute Indian delegation when they're visiting Hollywood studios. So who will have the star switching power to basically be identified as a star who can bring those conversations between two nation states together. So, and this is something that you will see as like a through line in all the chapters. So the first chapter on Soviet export film initiated exchange that made films that were co-productions between India and Soviet Union. I think I really like that chapter because that's where you will see that Swapnil's works in conversation with a couple of new books that came out recently, especially Samhita Sanya's book, where she also analyzed this film called Pardesi, which is a co-production between India and Soviet Union, and what co-production entails, especially when it involves significant amount of production as well as star figures from both the countries investing their time and energy in the pre-production process. And there's also a section in the book that has excerpts from the material that she collected from the archives in Moscow, which shows a breakdown of the films that were exhibited in different parts of Soviet Union, including Kazakhstan, Leningrad, Latvian, SSR, Kyrgyzstan. So I thought that was interesting because that is one of the ways in which the idea of transnational is expanded. When you're also looking at the Cold War formations and before the disintegration of Soviet Union, what are the different ways in which Indian cinema or Hindi cinema became part of this whole cultural conversation. And one thing to also keep in mind is that this is also in conversation with Sudha Rajagopal's book on Soviet movie-going, which is an absolutely brilliant book that looks at the way Indian films were used by Soviet Union in order to basically be part of an advice literature on how these films should be watched. So Network Bollywood contributes to scholarship that includes media convergence, especially with related to consumer industries. And again, another book that comes to my mind is Nitin Govil's Orienting Hollywood, a century of film culture between Los Angeles and Bombay. Again, this has significant kind of overlaps with the kind of framing that Swapnil is doing with this book. So one of the questions I have for Swapnil, maybe to think through, was what happens to contingency and conjectures in the star switching power? Because there is a predictability of success and longevity of success that you are premising in the star switching power. So what happens when there are conjectures or when there are failures? So that is something to think through because, like both Anuja and Mehli pointed out, there are secondary stars who might not be like Amitabh Bachchan or Shah Rukh Khan. Where do they feature here? Or is there a kind of an entrepreneurial spirit that is part and parcel of star switching power, where you have the capacity, iconicity to not only invest in financial kind of contribution towards filmmaking production, but also reimagine vertical integration in significant ways. So in that ways, are we also trying to make comparison between Hollywood and Hollywood stardom when you're talking about star switching power? So how does this idea of local and global gets reframed in significant ways? And the second thing is again touched upon by Anuja, but I'm also thinking about the question of upward social mobility and caste. Because there is a reification of caste class structures, so much so that it's taken for granted that it's an unmarked body in front of us. These are all marked bodies. So what happens to Dalit or Bahujan people who are in filmmaking industries, will they never have access to star making power or star switching power because they will never make it there because it's expecting that you needed to have a significant cultural clout even to be considered a person who can facilitate star switching. And the last thing is about the OTT streaming thing. Streaming platforms were initially seen as, facilitating democratization and opening it to everyone who wants to be part of the, process. But we do know of significant pushback and censorship in streaming platforms. Anurag Kashyap had many of his films being stalled. So I'm curious to know about the optimism that sometimes we see when we talk about streaming platforms and how far in your next project you're thinking about it. That there is always this kind of checks and balances that are kept in place, and it's only getting more reified and restructured, not in good ways. But there's also co-optation of narrative. So with the corporatization of streaming platforms, what are we losing in terms of thinking of labor relations? Because labor is something you touched upon in the book, but I'll be curious to know about where does the stars feature in terms of talking about labor conditions in the entertainment sector. Because only time I have seen Amitabh Bachchan, Shah Rukh Khan, and all of these main stars speak about it was during the COVID time, when they were ready to actually contribute money to support the labor force. But is there any kind of reflexive gestures towards understanding the structural relationships and political economy of the industry? And thank you so much, and looking forward to have more conversations.
I think, Shopnil, why don't you come here? Let's all sit here, and then we'll have Shopnil respond to the three respondents for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have the last half an hour open to all of you here for question and answer. But before this starts, I want to really thank all three of you for your response and the important questions that you have raised for Shopnil that I hope will enliven this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks to the three of you first for making the time to read the book and for all your generous comments and thoughtful questions. So maybe I will start with Darshana's questions because there is sort of an overlap and these are the freshest in my mind, although I took down very meticulous notes. So to your question of them being marked and unmarked bodies. So when I define switching power, I define it as being a body that has a certain class privilege, that has a certain caste privilege, because the whole idea of switching, to be a switch in that way, to exceed the networks to which you belong and create new connections, it's like a new circuit that you are illuminating through which now Bollywood cinema can move. So to have that kind of power, you have to be exceptional in so many ways, right? It cannot be, so it is difficult, right, for a person to not have those privileges and be switches in the same way. Because the story I tell are these mega stars. So not all stars can have switching power. That's why Irfan Khan cannot have switching power in the same way that an Amitabh Bachchan or Shah Rukh Khan has. Because one, there is a distinction that Anuja brought up in stardom. So I remember, I was also very interested in in Irfan Khan, because he was arguably he's the actor and the namesake. He's acted in so many global films, right? And during my fieldwork in India, I chanced upon him at the hotel at which I was staying. So I got a chance to meet him. He was such a nice, generous guy, and we had this whole conversation. And after that, I got to meet with Shyam Benegal, who was very generous too, and we discussed his book, My Concepts, and he says, which was really generative for me in thinking about who do I give switching power to. And he said there's a difference between stars and actors, right? Because I'm talking about, so the book isn't just about stardom and the industry, it's also a lot about how power, it's kind of a meta-theorization of power, how power operates through certain kinds of elite networks. and who gets to possess that kind of power is a specific kind of man, right? With a class privilege, with a caste privilege, with kind of part of being like these small world institutional and political networks. And that's what defines most of the case studies and how I have picked them, right? And for women, it's harder even because, so in the story, I talk about the one woman who really possessed switching power was the star called Devika Rani, who pre-independence owned a studio, was the owner of a studio in India called Bombay Talkies. And she could possess switching power despite her gender because she was so exceptionally elite. Like her grandfather on both sides of her family was Rabindranath Tagore. Her father was the Surgeon General of India. She was educated in the UK to the extent that after her first film performance, a British newspaper wrote about Devika Rani's clipped diction, that how she spoke English better than the Britishers. She had like aesthetic capital in abundance. She was exceptionally beautiful. So the fact that to be as a woman, to possess that kind of power. So my whole frame really is to theorize in that way. So to your point, to actually very starkly show why certain people can never hope to possess that kind of power. But like the hopeful thing in this whole story is the coming of streaming platforms, which has to be taken in with a little bit of caution because it's not all like liberatory in that way. So my book conclusion, I don't know if you got a chance to look at it, but it does look at what is changing with that power in relation to the state, in relation to now that we have a prime minister who's as much wanting to be a celebrity as a Shah Rukh Khan. And like in my other work, I have talked about the celebritization of politics in India and this kind of particular kind of leveraging of Bollywood. So to your question, Mehli, in the book, in the conclusion, I talk about how during COVID, during when the farmers' protests were happening in India, how Bollywood and Sushant Singh Rajput and Shah Rukh Khan being in jail for smoking weed, all of those come at key moments, when there is a big political crisis going on, and how the state, because it's kind of a structural story. It's about like how stars leverage this power, but how their power like is always in relation to other structures. So how they leverage it, how it's leveraged by the state as a distraction strategy, right? So during COVID, when Modi government is being blamed for all kinds of failures, you suddenly have the whole country and all these channels, as Mehli rightly pointed out, like obsessing over, did Sushant Singh Rajput, who's not a megastar, like did he kill himself, or was there some conspiracy that Bollywood created, and how did that happen? But at the same time, the focus totally shifted away from like all these workers dying on the streets, that other stars, Hollywood stars like Greta Thunberg and Rihanna, or Greta Thunberg isn't a star, but yeah, of that kind of clout, Rihanna were tweeting about, but suddenly the focus had gone so much into what was happening. Now, in terms of streaming platforms, so one thing I should note is that the next book, which is a co-authored book about transnational streaming platforms, is under contract. We just signed a contract. So it's a co-authored book looking at what do streaming platforms represent in terms of like the big business changes that are being created. And so some of the questions that you ask, we will probably answer there. Because this book, I mean, like you said, it reads like a book. It has a consistent through line because there was a particular story that I wanted to tell, which I think comes through. Yeah. So the other, what else? So your question about Muslim identity and the 1990s, them being marked bodies. So that's such a good question. The 1990s, I think, like I theorize it as the emergent network. because at that time, BJP was just coming into power. So this is kind of a flexible moment as we move from, a very Congress-driven idea of a very secular, syncretic Indian society to Bollywood, to BJP and BJP's India Shining narrative, within which you get like Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan. The interesting thing about, because Anuja so nicely talked about star text, because you cannot talk about stars without the affect, even though my book is so much about industry and power and how that operates. So it's about these meta questions. But since my object are the stars, it's important to say. And so when you think of a Shah Rukh Khan, you do not think of him as the Rais from Rais. In the 90s, you think about him as Raj Malhotra from Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, like very Hindu, very Punjabi, and he remains the Raj Malhotra like across all of those different texts. Similarly for Amir Khan, like the on-screen roles they play are very like mainstream Hindu roles, right? And their presentation, thinking about, Vijay Mishra has talked about actor as parallel text, thinking about their broader presentation in society, is to then think about how they come off to, in the general parlance, in the general discourse as stars. So all of these stars were very much part of the syncretic secular India discourse, because all of them had Hindu vibes, right, which was very much part of their narrative, very much part of their story. At the same time, in the 90s, like in that phase that you mentioned, there is this documentary called The Inner and Outer World of Shah Rukh Khan that's done by Nasreen Muni Kabir and with Channel 4 and BBC, which is all about like Shah Rukh Khan like getting big, performing these shows. But there's a segment in there where he takes the documentary crew to his like worship space in his house, and it's all these idols and deities, and he very much like tells everyone, but I believe in God, right? And there's Jesus on our shrine, there's all Indian gods on our shrine, and that we are believers, but we are spiritual, not necessarily, none of these stars mark themselves as Muslim. That also speaks to the eliteness. Darshana nicely talked about who is marked and who's unmarked. They are so exceptionally elite, right, that they can take on, that a Shah Rukh Khan can take on Modi and the state, even in the face of the interesting changes that are happening, and be like, oh, this is my comeback, and this is my movie, and kind of be even with the state and the negative political discourse around them. What else?
Swapna, can I just add
Yeah,
quickly?
yeah.
I was also curious about the mediatization of politics and how does certain bodies become switching power. MGR, for instance,
Yeah.
or N.T. Ramarao, or Kamal Hassan or Vijay, we do have like politicians, right?
Yeah,
who were stars at one point. So my question is, in the star switching power, there is a longevity associated with stardom.
Yeah.
Like you have to be in the industry. Is that one of the definitional parameters, or how would you think about semi politics, like Madhav Prasad's book, for instance, in conversation with your work?
Yeah, no. And so that's why I think my framework is interesting, because it doesn't, affective power is only a part of the story. What's also important is these elite men having all of this direct political power. The fact that Amitabh Bachchan goes and like is asked by Rajiv Gandhi to contest elections, and it wins these elections by a landslide that is yet to be matched by any politician, is not totally incumbent upon whether he continues to be a star or not. I'm sure that at that point, if he had made a switch like MTR and others to being like a politician for the rest of his career, that would have stayed that way. So, I mean, there's definitely an excess the stars possess beyond their screen power in the Indian context that has longevity. Not just, it's not incumbent upon continued screen presence, I think.
And I think you show that through the entrepreneurship, like that's where, like even with the Amitabh Bachchan, like the fact that he comes back with Kaun Banega
And
Crorepati.
AB Corp, right?
There-
Wasn't there a
Yeah.
different...
And
It's a
kind of
different
show
avatar of the same
things.
company.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, sort of building on Darshana's question, I think there's also a sort of slippery slope here. So even though Amitabh Bachchan won those elections, his fall from grace was also massive and catastrophic at one point, right? In the wake of Bofors, in the wake of the 1984 riots, the fallout with the Gandhi family, and Shah Rukh, of course, has had his own series of trials and tribulations in recent years. So it's also a very precarious power, which, because its relationship to the state is so unpredictable, right? So on the one hand, when a major crisis looms, all of us switch to, what's his name? Shah Rukh's son's name? I'm forgetting. Aryan. Did Aryan consume drugs, and how many grams did he consume, right? When there's a real national crisis happening there. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about this unpredictability of the network also. I mean, the network in your book, the network is very enabling. The network is very generative. The networks makes these fabulous things happen, not just for these individuals, but for the industry as a whole. And that's why it's such a buoyant read. You know, I mean, I felt so good reading the book. I was like, "Sab changasi, it's all good, you know." But there is also. This is what I meant by what would happen if we took a less positivist look at the question of both stars and networks and going to the question of Raiz, right? There's also a remarking of Shah Rukh's body. Like, he has very deliberately stepped away from the Raj Rahul to say, I'm a Muslim man, you know? And, I mean, we can talk about Amir Khan's friendship with...
That's what I meant, that when there is a shift from the 90s to the present, and if we are thinking about the present, that on the one hand there are the OTTs where you very rightly showed that the stars continue, that entrepreneurship, kind of a building of a network, but what about their own repositioning? And I was thinking precisely that the marking of their body, like how, like in the gestures and the star text, the kind of films like from Raiz to Pathaan to Jawan, like there is, one can see that what role are those then playing in fashioning or requiring this conversation about that, is there a re-strategization and a repositioning that necessitates for us to rethink the way these networks are also having to shift under these pressures, so to say.
So one of the big things that I want to say is that when I theorize networks, the first thing I say is these networks are flexible. And the second thing I want to say, I tell a buoyant story, but I always tell that this is not a atomistic kind of power. It is a relational power that operates in relation to all of these other structures and changes based on how these structures shift. That is why the book ends with, you know, as these stars that held this power are pushing 50, are now the one thing, why they continue to possess this power, and only certain ones will continue, is because they have a lot of structural industrial power. They're effective. Like Shah Rukh Khan is one of the top 5 highest paid stars in the world. Like, he makes the most money. Like, I think Seinfeld, Jerry's son, he was number 1. I guess we watch a lot of Seinfeld reruns, but the Forbes list had, I think, Shah Rukh Khan at number 3 or 5, something. He was in the top 5. So he's one of the richest people in the world. And it's not just because he's a star, it's because he's also a very shrewd businessman. So the other story my book traces is like how from a film industry, Bollywood emerges and becomes this veritable global entertainment industry that now includes India's other big passion, cricket. So Shah Rukh Khan is the one, he owns, like, and you guys will hear more about it as, you know, the cricket leagues in the US become more known, which is already starting here, but he's the owner of all these big cricketing leagues, Kolkata Knight Riders, that has a UAE chapter, that has like an India chapter, and so thinking about them, that's why the correlation with Murdoch is important, because these stars are more than stars. However, as like I talked about, now that we are in this network Bollywood phase where Bollywood has shifted from like this one star-led production company where the father plays the on-screen father, where the friend writes the screenplay, the girlfriend is the on-screen love interest, to a thing where everything about Bollywood is managed by these multiple stakeholders, going from one manager does it all and directly reports to the star, to this whole agglomerated network where talent agencies, casting agencies, all of this play a role, which then creates stars in certain ways. So Priyanka Chopra is whom I call the star of network Bollywood, because like her whole move to the United States was supported by a particular manager and agency, like a person, Indian origin person based in the UK, who wanted to create an agency and have these kind of crossover stars. And she was the one who identified Chopra as a star that could do this kind of crossover, because like she'd spent some time in the US when she was in high school, and she does the crossover through the music industry and so on. That is also a time where talent agencies like CAA have a presence in India. And so if you watched Call My Agent, which has multiple versions, so there's an Indian version on Netflix. So how like it becomes, to your point, so mediated across different steps. But I also take your point that this could also be have been mapped as a history of failures just through the disjunctures. That is not the story that I'm telling, but that is also a parallel book that I could write, because I did meet with Kabir Bedi, who is arguably one of India's biggest stars, who told me all of these things that he wanted to do. Like he wanted to start a international production. All of this was in my dissertation. It's just that when you're, like you said, when you want to make it a book, you know, there's one thing that you have to say. And sometimes, you know, as Umberto Eco says, like the book is smarter than the author. So you can get more by reading this than by listening to me. So, yeah.
So on that note, let's open the conversation to the audience. So I was just wondering if any one of you have any questions for Swapnil and the speakers.
Thank you.
A couple of personal questions, not totally relevant to the theme of your book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I sporadically watch Bollywood movies. Okay, they're totally lovely, entertaining, but nothing could be compared to the riveting impact on me when I watched Amelia Nair's Salon Bombay many decades ago, just like you, when I was a young clinical assistant professor at the Brown.
Yeah.
And that film is low budget, has no networking. So my question is, could those kind of great work, and it's due to a unique time and age maybe of the director, and the cultural climate, and socio-economical, political environment, and it cannot be duplicated again.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. So I do, so I'm a particular, so I will like kind of claim some institutional clout here, because I went to this college called Miranda House, where Meera Nair also started a degree and then moved to Harvard after a year in that program. And so I think that it's not that filmmakers like Nair are without clout. They occupy a very interesting interstitial in-between space, in between two worlds, right? So Nair has a lot of institutional clout in terms of, you know, and possesses all the kinds of class, caste, other hierarchies that enable her to move in that way from India to the US. In the US, she goes to Harvard, has definitely the kind of institutional capital. But you're right, it is like an example of a very interesting cinema, but the kind of story that she can tell through Salam Bombay is a story that she could tell because she was located in the US. You know, it's hard to narrate similar kinds of like gritty truths about India when you are located in India, even at that time in the 80s. So I think her interstitiality, her in-betweenness gives. So Hamid Nafisi has talked about diasporic filmmakers in that way, that they, in some ways, they have less power and sort of on the margins, but also their in-betweenness of between two cultures enables them to tell certain kinds of stories, bring a certain lens that is not possible.
So her work is an outlier.
An outlier,
Outlier,
yes.
okay. So in a larger thing, you know, with the current, the commercial success of the Bollywood, you know, and as you described, could that threat to sniff off any frame of originality in young talents, you know, in India?
Yeah. So, I mean, very much, because my book also talks about, because it's all about power. It's about how power operates. Like, it's about gendered power, but it's also like socio-political, cultural power, but it's also about kinship ties. So my book has this huge diagram that talks about like close kinship networks. So who gets entry into Bollywood, right? And who doesn't? So it's like they are all so like still closely related to each other. Like it's a very incestuous industry network. So
you're saying the sad story is kind of regression to the creativity, right?
It's a regression, but the positive thing is the coming of streaming platforms is sort of democratizing that space somewhat.
So sure about that, but we can talk. You have a question there? Yeah. I have a question for the audience.
Thank you. Thanks for this great talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Kind of picking up from what Professor Darshana was kind of talking about, just this comparison, you know, people like MGR, NTR, Rajkumar in Kannada cinema had a lot of this switching power, right? Star switching power, clearly, at least in retrospect. But were they never interested in leveraging their networks in a larger context? Because you don't have the sort of course, stardom today is very different than what it was in the 50s and 60s, right? One cannot compare an actor from the 50s with Shah Rukh Khan today. It's like transnational, as you pointed out. But was it the size of regional cinema, the money involved, or what about regional cinema prevented this kind of popularity in, well, of course, maybe not in the US, but even in the Soviet Union or in other parts of Asia or in you know, Europe and places like that. So just kind of a comparative, you know, I know it's probably not the core of your book, clearly not, but just kind of thinking about a comparative perspective on Southern Indian cinema and Bollywood, even though, as you said today, Bollywood is everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you. So that's thanks to you and Darshana for bringing this up, because definitely so my book is the first one that is actually doing this kind of study of stars as businessmen that enabled globalization in this way. But if I were to look for a model for people that stars that really did possess switching power and were directly the political elite in that way, that would be the South Indian stars, right? In fact, the only book that I could find, which was different because it was like this direct correlation to politics, was this book on the South called Celluloid Deities, where the kind of affective leverage that these stars, the South Indian stars, can have, how that directly translates to politics is the story. So which is very much, and my story kind of is more about not just the political, but also the economic and also the sociocultural, and how they used it to leverage it for globalization. I think one thing, as you rightly yourself in your question pointed out, is that there has been like the Indian state, the Indian government, the central government has been very Hindi-centric and Hindi-oriented, right? So in my story, in my book, there is a story as to why was it that Avara and Devanand Sarahi and Dilip Kumar's film. Like, why were these three films picked in a context where the state never kind of bothered with cinema? Why did they pick these three films to send to the Soviet Union or have that screening? And the answer very clearly lies in the fact, talking about networks, is these close ties that Prithvi Raj Kapoor's father, had with Nehru. They were very good friends, and it happened like informally. Like Brown is a very elite institution, and I guess like it doesn't require that much underscoring to say like how certain kind of elite networks operate, that there are specific kind of in-networks that get you access in a way that if you're outside of it, they don't, right? So clearly they had switching power because they directly translated it to politics, but probably some of those stars, as Darshana also pointed out, maybe didn't have the investment in to continue being film stars in the same way. So probably they did not really explore like the globalization possibilities because they literally switched careers, right? And used whatever their cachet as stars to kind of build and go on being politicians.
I mean, one example is like it's not exactly Southern Indian, but and neither the cinema. It's Imran Khan in Pakistan. So he switches his cricketing power to become a politician. Whereas I think in the case of Southern Indian stars who become politicians, also you have to understand is that both MGR, NTR, the majority, and which is what the book Celluloid Deities talk about, is majority of work they did in their career were in religious films. So they acted as Krishna and Ram in almost all the Southern films. So what they did is that they capitalized their religiosity into politics, which for them in the 70s and the 80s was the zenith. You don't need to be a global star because you're already the chief minister of Tamil Nadu. You're already the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh. I mean, the next step would be to become the Prime Minister of India.
Yeah.
So I think at that sense, they already reached a zenith of that switching possibility. Whereas in the case of Shah Rukh and especially the 21st century stars, I think there's a very key difference, which is what her book very beautifully shows, is that there's a very key difference between the 20th century stars like Devanand, Dilip Kumar, Amitabh Bachchan, a little bit of Rajesh Khanna. Their switching possibilities, they are working in a very different, let's say, capitalistic, nationalistic framework, whereas in early 21st century with Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan, they are working in a very different dynamics altogether. Again, the moment she talks about year 2001 is a very extraordinary important marker for the Indian film industry, is that's when it becomes the industry. Suddenly there's a massive amount of global money flow starts happening. And that's a very key shift to kind of shift, and also two kinds of switching paths. On that note, I have a question for you. I'm just thinking, what is the future in the sense is that I think Shah Rukh Khan and the three Khans are growing old. And I think so. There are different kinds of stars emerging, and we have the rise of right-wing stars. Right, you have Akshay Khanna, who's doing Akshay Kumar, and then you have Kangana Ranaut. There are these two different kinds of stars emerging, who are capitalizing both on global right-wing circulation and what the present authoritarian dispensation is doing in India. So I was wondering, how do you look at that, and how does it move forward, this kind of switching? Whereas I think, in a certain sense, in my head, I think it's very clear. I think yesterday night, Modi and Amit Shah was saying, I think the first list of 100 MPs are going to be out, and there is a word that Kangana and Akshay might be. So I'm wondering where that. How have you thought about that? And it's not in the book, but have you thought about that?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about Modi and the celebritization of politics. I have a article that just came out. It's called Between the Divine and Digital. And I have written another piece that's called May the Force Be With You, and thinking about Modi and his pronouncement in Madison Square Gardens when he first comes alongside Hugh Jackman, like Wolverine literally standing next to him, and him giving a Star Wars slogan, May the Force Be With You. And then also the other thing that I get into with the article is the very important Bollywood selfie. that is, I don't know if you guys remember, but there's a famous Bollywood selfie in which Modi is like very strategically and aesthetically placed at the center of the selfie, flanked by all of these big stars. So where he appears like relationally as the bigger star. So this blending of politics, especially with stars like Kangana, like Akshay Kumar, I see as kind of building towards a bigger celebrity for Modi. Between the divine and digital, talking about divinity through celluloid deities, it's a very similar move, but it's more deeper than that, because it's very structurally leveraging stardom, stars, the Bollywood industry, and all of that, and a very clever use of the digital space and the PR machinery in the way that Modi is being presented as the ideological salvation for a nation, for the near future. I mean, yeah. I think I will. I mean, this is kind of a live broadcast, so I will stop myself there. But I would encourage you to read my article between the divine and digital. I could even send it to you. Yeah.
Any more? Yeah, we have 10-15 minutes more. Yeah.
Yeah. So great presentation. I just have a quick question on like when you're thinking and conceptualizing like the network and what happens when you have like a star like Shah Rukh Khan who gets older and is less in film, and the relationality to being in film, what does that do to their switching power? Like, if the precariousness of like politics and everything else like that, which they've been able to do, but then also as a movie star, they can always fall back on that, which helps kind of secure and ground their power. But what happens when they're less in film and they're less working, right? And they're kind of relying on that other form of businessman or kind of politician or you know, that type of power in that other ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, all of these stars that we are talking about, I mean, one cautious note that I end the book on is that kind of possibility of the standalone switching power even exist anymore as we get to this very agglomerated network structure with so many intermediaries across different scales. Also a state that now also wants to strategically leverage even more so and be a part of this whole process. That's a great question. At least for Shah Rukh Khan, I can say that he has established, and he has in interviews and in other places talked about, I mean, business being the next thing. The aura of stardom, like for him, is long-lasting and compelling, but you're right. I mean, the fact that he's had 3 new movies come out and be hits in a way has really kind of fueled his presence in all of these different circuits. So like there is the continual presence in film, like that's why the affect and effect sort of go together. But then there's also a longevity to the stardom of certain megastars, right? That exists even beyond, you know, their and you don't know. Like for Bachchan, for example, he's still acting in films. He's almost 80, and yeah.
Please, question.
Hi, thank you so much for all of you for being here today. You kind of touched a little bit on this relationship between the rise of Hindutva and the film industry, but I had a question more about the longevity of it and like contemplating what that looks like in the future. You know, thinking specifically about how many of the major stars today, some of which we talked about, were at the opening of the Ram Mandir or are, you know, still to this day acting in these films that we have this discourse around for having these like stock Hindu heroes and the villainization of Muslims and jingoism, war propaganda. Those things have felt like they've been in the discourse around the film industry for many years, and I don't see how that would change in the future. And I'm just curious if you think that the complicity of the film industry with the rise of Hindu nationalism is kind of just inherent to the current structures with Modi's India and will maybe continue to do so until we have like a new generation of star power, or is that something that do you ever see like a future in which these stars have the ability to counteract that the prominence of Hindutva? And I think about stars like the Muslim stars we're talking about right now that are like the biggest stars in India could have so much power with if they were more vocal about some of these things, but are definitely not going to be making the decision to do those things because it doesn't work in their best interest. So, yes, I guess my question is, how do you see that panning out in the future, or is this something that just feels very inherent to the way that the film industry is now and its relationship to the Modi government?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is where, like, you know, like I said, I've written like 3 articles on the celebritization of politics. Also, like, I have a special issue that's just come out thinking about the celebritization of politics in global media culture that looks at not just Modi, but the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Jair Bolsonaro. It looks at Trump, where, like, he points out Kanye West as this is my African American, like thinking about how politics and celebrity are being, have become like so much part of this broader realm where it's, yeah, entertainment has become like so central to political discourse where the leaders themselves are stars or like try to leverage that kind of celebrity-like charisma. So personally, I think that the way that Indian politics is headed, it's difficult, especially since where the book ends, I say that kind of standalone structural power beyond this aging generation of stars is not possible because the structure itself has changed. Everything is mediated. So there are moments of agency where I say like women, because you know, Netflix, as they call it, is a big disruptor. So women like female stars like Anushka Sharma and Alia Bhatt then can all start their own production companies and be entrepreneurs in a way and have like in these moments of rupture have some power. But the only place, I mean, I guess it's up to the stars that do have that kind of power, like a Shah Rukh Khan, like a Amir Khan, to actually speak up. However, the way that the Indian politics is evolving, and I see the intersection of the media space with the political, I don't think, I mean, for the present moment, I don't have a very buoyant or positive answer for you. Yeah.
Can I just add, you know, if you go back to the 60s, 50s, or even earlier, Muslim actors actually changed their names to Hindu names, right? Maybe Dilip Kumar, Sunil Dutt, and so on, right? I think what Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan, and maybe even Salman Khan have done is to kind of stop that. Possibly, I don't know, I mean, maybe in hindsight we would say that they've kind of allowed a strong Muslim presence to exist in Bollywood on its own rather than hiding behind a Hindu name so you can, you don't have to reveal your religious identity.
Yeah.
So maybe it is. So
yeah.
I think you're absolutely right that in the face of Hindutva, you're going to see a greater, probably marginalization of minority religions, right? And it's probably likely to happen even in Bollywood.
Yeah.
But this kind of provides a counterpoint. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And even like thinking about, say, a Shah Rukh Khan and how his recent hits, the 3 movies that have come out and how he's responded to, or his fans have responded to what happened to him and his son, and this is his answer, is to push back against this majoritarian discourse to say that India is in practice and in the constitution a secular country, and with the way like asserting his presence is a way to say, well, we are here, and very much like if you watch the 3 of his recent films, it's all about carving out a niche and that space for a Muslim hero within the broader like fabric of the nation. Like in one of them, like he's literally the spy and like fighting for the country. So it is in a way like one a declaration of loyalty to the country, but also, as to your point, also asserting in the same way, this is my nation as much as yours, right? And interestingly, like so I'm right now teaching a class on Bollywood cinema, and we showed Mughal-e-Azam. And when I showed that movie, I told my students some student asked a question about Islamic identity, and I said, well, it was made by a Muslim director. Both the actors, even though their names are Dilip Kumar and Madhubala, are Muslim. So then they asked, well, why did they change their name? And I went back and looked. Apparently, there's this story where Dilip Kumar wanted a job with Devika Rani's Bombay Talkies, and Devika Rani said, well, Yusuf, like, yeah, your name is a mouthful. So, I mean, the impetus wasn't really to Hinduize Dilip Kumar, but it was more to give him a name with a certain cachet that would be like catchy, and that people would come watch the film. Yeah. And similarly for Madhubala's name too, that was the story. Maybe it was a facade and a rationale, but I don't know. I mean, all the news stories that I found from that time period to answer my students' questions, that's the answer I found. Yeah.
I think we can have another question before we wrap up.
Do the old stock, do they cultivate the young generations?
Do they?
Of actors, or like this country, you look at politicians, like
Yeah.
they're all geriatric. Yeah, how about India, movie business? The old people kind of cultivate young people to rise up.
They cultivate their sons and
and
grandsons.
Okay. So just like
Everyone. It's very nepotistic.
I think we have to end this, but
One question.
oh, do we have time, Pawan?
Yes, why not?
Yeah.
One last question.
Thank you for this talk. I have a different question. You said that Meera Nair was able to make Salam Bombay because he was not located in India. But what about Shekhar Kapoor? He made Bandit Queen, and he started with Masoom, and then he made Bandit Queen, and then he moved to Hollywood. So what was that? And also my second question is, when he made Bandit Queen, Seema Biswas didn't become any kind of star. Means Ratnasa Pathak, Supriya Pathak, they never became any kind of star. But when Anurag Kashyap made Gangs of Wasseypur, Pankaj Tripathi became kind of star. Nawazuddin Siddiqui became a superstar. Means he's not touched that layer of Shah Rukh Khan, but he's still a star. So why this has not happened with the female stars? Means is the stardom gender bias in India, or because like the popularity which Naseeruddin Shah and Om Puri touched, Smita Patel and Savannah Ajmi never touched.
Yeah.
But they were also part of that
Yeah,
that
actor.
whole process.
Yeah.
So is stardom is gender bias in India?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a great question. I mean, the other day, I was watching this, I chanced upon this interview on YouTube where Anupam Kher was interviewing Naseeruddin Shah and Om Puri, and they talked about the National School of Drama in Delhi. And as I looked deeper into it, I realized like Neena Gupta, Satish Kaushik, all of them were at the National School of Drama around the same time. They all knew each other, but you look at the level of, they are not stars in the same way that a Bachchan or a Shah Khan is, but they are actors. Like that category is the one you are referring to, who as an actor and has an acting acumen makes it and who doesn't. And it's definitely, you're absolutely right, it's very gendered. And so my book looks at popular stars. To give you a small analogy which is related. So we look at, during COVID, some of my research, everybody talks about colloquially when it comes to Bollywood cinema and its globalization. You ask XYZ person who's visited Egypt once, and you say, oh, Indian cinema is very popular because I got out of the cab and somebody said, hey, do you know Amitabh Bachchan? Are you Indian? People have anecdotal stories about, oh, Bollywood in Egypt, Bollywood in Russia, and so on. What my book very particularly went and did was, okay, well, Indian media will say Indian cinema is popular in Israel and in here and there. How do you figure out from the other side what they were really doing? And so the important work I think I do is get the archival materials from Egypt, from Russia, and so on. And in that process, for the Russian material, what I found was Raj Kapoor, so there's just all these documents that we found with different types of Indian filmmakers writing to the Russians, we want to do a co-production with you. And there was a letter that I found. And so Awara is a big film. It was super popular. It's not that Nargis was not popular. Nargis was equally popular as Raj Kapoor. However, when both Raj Kapoor and Nargis went to Russia, how they were treated differently. For Raj Kapoor, they got a train coupe they used for the czars to transport him from one place to the other. For Nargis, there was actually a letter stating that nobody even went to drop her off to the airport because, like, whatever, Comrade XYZ had no time. And so to think about her, when they started off together, like Nargis is in many ways a bigger star, but they see the co-production that you talk about really happens with a Russian actor and her as the female star. But the treatment of the two is gendered, and I think that in a similar vein, popularity is gendered too. And and Shekhar Kapoor, I mean, I don't quite remember the specifics of Bandit Queen at this time, but I'll get back to you on that. I think that was also, like, there was some foreign money and foreign investment in that project.
Both Salam Bombay and Bandit Queen were produced by NFDC. So they are both coming from a different production logic. They're not Bollywood in that sense. So both of these films are state funded. So that has a different logic of both production and the logic of politics and the logic for audience. So that's a very different kind of films, not Bollywood in any sense.
Yeah, and my book actually makes that distinction to talk about how the Indian state never supported Bollywood, and when they did think about cinema, they started their own parallel network, which is the NFDC, and so which is to say that how their understanding of cinema was very elite, in the sense that what were the popular narratives were very plebeian and kind of beneath them. So yeah, it does that work to situate those two as different.
I have an announcement to make. There are snacks and drinks outside. Please, I think it is time now to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to thank the audience and thank Swapnil and the three respondents for coming all the way to respond to the films and have this extraordinary discussion. Thank you, everybody.